Oh, okay. So welcome everyone to a workshop, really a presentation, hopefully with some interactivity around a deeper dive into HCCC Student Success Data. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm John Scanlon, Executive Director of Institutional Research. I've been at the college just over a year, and what a year it's been. It's an exciting time to be doing institutional research, but also like everyone else, it's a challenging time. And so amidst that challenging time, we've chosen to launch our Student Success Initiative, which I think is a good strategy. And we're going to look at some of the data that undergird that and are informing that, and then do some brainstorming around what other data would be useful for thinking about student success as we move forward through this year and through the future. Before we get started, a couple of thanks and acknowledgement. Thanks to you all for attending. I know College Service Day is a long day. It's a long day when you're online. I will try to be brisk and entertaining and keep you engaged, but I thank you for coming to the session. I'd like to thank Dorothea, Graham King, and Kevin Ang for giving support on the background here, making sure the session goes as smoothly as possible. And I'd like to thank fellow members of the Dream Team who worked very hard this year on coming up with some student success priorities and goals that were informed by data, some of the data we're going to look at today, that came up with some, I think, very achievable, flexible, and easy to understand goals that I think will be useful targets for us in the coming years. So with that, I'm going to move forward. As Dorothea noted in the chat, we'll try to do question and answer in the chat as opposed to over the microphone. I think it's just easier to manage, but we'll see how we do moving forward. So I'm going to start with an image. Some of you may recognize this. This is a still from the film Memento, which is Christopher Nolan, one of Christopher Nolan's first films. I included this, I thought of this for a couple of reasons. One is, if you've seen the film, you'll remember that the character who's on the screen here has amnesia. He doesn't remember anything, but he's trying to figure out what has happened and to recreate the steps that have got him to where he is. The second piece that I remember distinctly from the film is half of the film, or a good part of the narrative, occurs backwards in time. And so sometimes when I'm in the depth of data analysis, I feel like an amnesiac who's trying to go backwards in time and figure out what happened. So this film has always stuck with me when I think about it. As a word nerd, I also like the fact that memento sounds like momentum, and we're going to talk about momentum later. But I think this film, among other things, is about time, right? And as President Reber has said over the last couple of weeks, when we think about student success, student momentum, and completion, time is an important factor, especially for some of the more traditional metrics we use to measure student success, where time can be the enemy. And so we're going to look at some of those factors, but we're also going to think about how we manipulate time when we're thinking about student success in terms of when do we measure things, when do we look at data, when do we decide that something is important, and when do we intervene? So time is another important theme as we think about student success. So our agenda for today, in the spirit of the film, we're going to move backwards. So we're going to start at the end. One traditional end of student success is completion. We're going to start there, and then we're going to move to retention and persistence, and then we're going to look at what we call in the biz early momentum and some key indicators. Then I'm hoping we can have a little brainstorm around the current moment, and this is in keeping with the theme of of the whole day. But given where we are and the intersection of student success, COVID-19, and remote learning, are there some ideas out there about metrics, data, analyses we can do to really focus on that intersection and narrow that in, especially for this term as we move to a term of hybrid instruction and hybrid learning? And then we'll leave some time for Q&A. But as we move through, if you do have questions, please plop them into the chat. And if I miss them, Dorothea is monitoring things and will let me know. So again, we're moving from back to front, but let's start with a linear, traditional model of student success, which is we go from early momentum to persistence to completion. And again, I'm going to go backwards. So I'm going to start at completion, go back to persistence, and then to early momentum. We're going to complicate this model as we move forward, right? Because completion is not the only indicator of student success, but this is a traditional way of thinking about it, and we're going to start there. Okay, excuse me while I look at some notes here. So we're going to start talking about completion. I'm sure for many of you, you've seen this a few times over the past year. You're starting to get tired of it, but it's an important place to focus our attention and to understand the data we're seeing. So we're going to look at the most popular, for unfortunate reasons, and traditional measure of completion, which is the IPEDS first time, full time, 150% graduation rate. That's a mouthful. And a way to translate that is, it is the percentage of first time, full time degree seeking students that receives a degree or certificate within 150% of the expected degree length. That's also a mouthful. But for community college students, practically this means anyone who receives a degree or degree or certificate within 3 years of starting at the college, since the associate degree is a 2-year degree. Just for your edification, as I'm moving through slides, over on the side here, I have definitions in case you're not familiar with particular terms like IPEDS, first time, full time, and so forth. I may not go through them all, but I may reference them as we move forward. So this is our data on our 3-year graduation rate, this particular metric. So these are the 4 most recent cohorts. So this is the term the cohort entered the college. This is the total number of people in that cohort. This is the number of people who completed a degree or certificate within 3 years. And this is the 3-year graduation rate. So you'll see over the past couple of years, a incremental but important increase in this rate. So from 12% in 2014 to hot off the presses, our fall 2017, we just nudged over 14%, which is good. I think people will be happy about that. This is our data. This is what we have a question. Are those national and New Jersey averages just for community colleges? Yes, they are. We're not comparing ourselves to 4-year colleges in this data. So this is where we are. We are seeing some incremental improvement, which is satisfying. Comparatively, however, and look at this bullet over here, our rates are low, right? The most recent national average is 27%. The most recent New Jersey average is 24%. So that's something to keep in mind. And let's move to a little bit of an interactive piece. So we know the rates, we know that Hudson's are low, but I have a question for you, and if you can put your answers in the chat, and then we'll see how many of them I anticipated and how many we can add to the list. What are some of the limitations of first time, full time, 3-year graduation rate when we can consider it success? What are some problems with that measure? I'll give us about a minute. Very nice, very nice. Veronica, where to start? We have Dev Ed placement from Jenny Bobea. Someone asked what percent completes in 2 years. I don't have that at fingertips, but it's very low. From Eric, language learners need more time to master language. Many students come academically unprepared. High rates of basic needs insecurity. Students excluded from the first-time full-time cohort. These are all great. These are all right in line. We'll save the chat so we can add to our list when we publish this presentation. So I'm going to show you some answers, and again, we can add, as these answers come in through chat, we can add them to our growing list. Some answers that I came up with. This metric is designed for traditional 4-year residential colleges. It was really created with that model in mind. And applying that model to a 2-year college with a much more diverse community that is not residential often is not a good fit. As some of you are saying in various ways in the chat, it does not reflect the lived reality of our students sometimes. So Linda Miller says raising families and working at the same time, you end up with discontinuous enrollment, students who enroll, who stop out, who return, who stop out, who cobble together their education over time again. We see shifts between part-time and full-time. We see, as someone mentioned, basic needs insecurity. So these metrics don't account for any of that, and they don't really think about that because, again, they're based on this traditional model. They don't reflect the entire student body. I think this came through in the chat too. Students who start part-time, students who are transferring in, students who are coming, anyone who is not first-time, full-time is not reflected in this metric. With this bullet, I was trying to get at something that several of you mentioned in the chat, which is it's difficult and really often impossible target for students who are not college ready, for students learning language, for students involved in developmental academic foundations courses. This is often not a feasible target. Students changing majors is one that's come through as well. These are all great. Another one that is, has come up and is something that I've understood more through my first year working at a community college is not all degree-seeking students may actually intend to seek a degree, right? There are many reasons someone may enter a degree program. It might be that the student is, for example, interested in mastering English and is taking ESL, and because of financial aid and other concerns, they're enrolled as a degree-seeking student, but their ultimate goal may not be a degree or may not initially be a degree. It may be some other form of success or credential. And that gets folded in when we just look at the first-time, full-time completion rate. So that's great. So when we think about completion, then one thing we can do is broaden how we measure completion and how we think about completion. So I'm going to look at some broadening, and that this is moving from the IPEDS model to the voluntary framework of accountability model. Heather, President Reber, and others have talked about this over the last couple of weeks. But just for those of you who aren't familiar with the VFA, the Voluntary Framework of Accountability, it's a national organization that encourages community colleges to voluntarily join and report data, and they produce student success and other metrics using broader, more comprehensive frameworks than what we see in IPEDS. So we have joined the VFA and we've submitted data. It's still being validated, so this is all sort of drafty. It will be published in a couple of weeks, but I'm pretty sure that the data are more or less robust and will look pretty much like what we see on the screen. So just to walk you through what some of these success metrics look like. So we have our traditional, I'm looking at students entering in fall 2013 because we need a longer framework. And again, this is about time, right? So we need 6 years under the VFA model to really see what students are doing. So let's start with that cohort who started in fall 2013. If we look at that traditional IPEDS metric, first time, full time, 3-year graduation rate, for that cohort, so that's back a few years, that rate was 10%. iPads also has another metric which doesn't get as much airtime, but they have started collecting and reporting on it, which is a first-time, full-time, 6-year graduation rate. That's 22%. And then the VFA has all kinds of metrics, and I've chosen a couple just to highlight. And to emphasize the differences between the VFA and iPads, the VFA includes all students entering the institution in a given fall semester. So not just first time, not just full time, all students. However, so that's a broadening. They shrink it a bit though, and this is very interesting for Hudson, and I think indicates how much the VFA has really thought about what it's doing. They exclude students who are enrolled exclusively in ESL during their first term. The rationale here is those students, until they enroll in at least one non-ESL course, we shouldn't start the clock on measuring their outcomes, on measuring their success. So it acknowledges that students starting in ESL have some barriers to overcome, have some work to do in terms of language acquisition, and then can get into a kind of state where their progress can be measured. So some metrics from the VFA. A 6-year graduation rate for all entering students. And again, that entering, the caveat is it doesn't include students who are exclusively in ESL. For that cohort, that rate was 25%. But if we look at the graduation or transfers, so students who are either graduating from Hudson or transferring elsewhere, that rate bumps up to 46%. So almost half the cohort has achieved a quantifiable measure of success, either graduating or transferring elsewhere. That's a much bigger number than we're used to seeing. If we think about what VFA calls the credential-seeking cohort, which is students who earn at least 12 credits by the end of their second year of enrollment, which is they're taking as a proxy for sort of the student indicating that they are serious about earning a credential and intend to continue earning a credential. If you look at that cohort, our 6-year graduation rate is 36%, and our 6-year graduation or transfer rate is 56%. So these are much higher numbers than we're used to seeing. An objection to these might be, well, you're just counting differently in a way that you bring more people into the mix. But and in a sense that's true, but in a deeper sense, the VFA has really thought about who we're counting when we start to track their progress, and really what it means to be successful either in terms of graduation or transferring out. So I think these are useful metrics for us to keep monitoring as we move forward and to make public, to give a better, more fuller picture of the progress of our students. Incidentally, and I didn't put this in the chart, but if we look at our VFA metrics, we're closer to national averages than we are when we look at iPads metrics. Linda Miller asked, how do we know a student transfers? We know that through the, yes, exactly, the National Student Clearinghouse registers their enrollment at another institution, so we know that they went somewhere else. We call that a transfer in this language. They may not actually be transferring credit. It really just means a re-enrollment somewhere else. All right, so let's move forward. So let's finish up with our notes on completion, right? The iPad's 150% graduation rate has some significant limitations, and we've done a really good job here of listing them. But the reason we're talking about it, and we still talk about it, and people get tired of talking about it, is it is an important measure to track because it is used heavily in compliance. For example, our accreditor uses this rate in our annual institutional update. And it's used in various rankings. So when ranking organizations go out and grab data to compare institutions, often they only have a shallow knowledge of higher education and of student success, and they go grab data they can find from iPads, and this data element shows up. And so we have to keep on top of this for compliance and accreditation reasons, and we have to know that other people are using it. That doesn't mean it's the only thing we can use, but we have to know that it's out there. As I'm sure you've heard over the last couple of weeks, graduation rate is a lagging indicator. It tells us an important outcome, do people graduate or not? But by the time we measure it, it's too late to intervene. We can't, to return to our theme, go back in time and tweak something to cause a student to change their course and graduate. So in terms of setting a goal and deciding what interventions make sense, graduation rate is too late. It's something that's important to monitor, and it's something we think other elements are going to affect, but it lags behind those, what we call leading indicators. And the VFA, as we've seen, provides measures of student success that are more comprehensive and better reflect the real experience of community college students. They're not perfect, no metrics are, but they give that broader sense. And when they get published in the next couple of weeks, we can use that moment to socialize these numbers both on campus and with our fellow community members and to the public at large to really tell a better story about student success. So let's move further back in time from graduation to retention. I'm just doing a time check here. So I used to work with a senior leader at a previous institution who jokingly said that sometimes she was a member of the department of the blindingly obvious. And something that occurred to me that is blindingly obvious, that is a no-brainer, is that to complete a degree, you have to be retained, you have to come back, you have to continue your studies. If you leave before completing, obviously you won't complete. That's a no-brainer. But just to put that into perspective and to really make that crystal clear, let's look at some hard data here. So for those same cohorts we were looking at earlier, so fall 2014, fall 2017. So for students who, the first column here is students who entered in a fall and then subsequently enrolled in the next fall. This is their graduation, their 3-year graduation rate. So it ranges from 21% to 24%. For students who entered in a fall and that did not enroll in the subsequent fall, their graduation rate is 0. That 3-year graduation rate is 0. Now, there are, if you put this out to several decimal places, there are some students who do graduate because they don't enroll and then they re-enroll, but that's very unusual and it doesn't happen very much. And for all intents and purposes, that graduation rate is 0. So this is this is a no-brainer, but it's important to remember. Someone asked, what are the leading indicators of completion? The first major leading indicator is retention. Are the students being retained? Are they coming back? And if they're not, there's really no chance of meeting that 3-year graduation rate. Of course, if we think about the longer term, the numbers would change, but this is an important framework for thinking about, again, that IPEDS number and have the importance of So my something happened with my funky button, but so we're just going to say retention is one form of persistence, right? We're going to use the term persistence. Retention is one type of persistence. What are some other examples of persistence? As you think of examples, throw them into the chat, but I'll just go through my list here. Obviously, completing a degree or certificate indicates that you persisted and got to your goal. Gaining an industry recognized credential, which may not be a degree or certificate in the traditional sense, is another form of persistence. As we've seen, retention, staying enrolled is a form of persistence. Transferring to another institution to pursue further study is another form of persistence. Attending class through the end of semester, earning a certain number of credits, these are good. And then I put a couple in italics because these are harder to measure, but these are something that I know I would like to return to as we continue to look at student success this year. Obtaining a desirable job regardless of educational attainment. So a student is studying, but an opportunity presents itself. They have the requisite training, they have the requisite skills, they get hired into a role, they haven't finished a degree or certificate. From the student's point of view, that is, they're succeeding and persisting towards their goals. From a purely institutional point of view, it might look like they are not unless we are able to track that. another form of persistence, completing a specific educational goal, which may not result in a credential. This harkens back to what we talked about earlier. If someone is primarily attending the college, at least initially, in order to master English to complete the ESL cycle, that is a perfectly reasonable and admirable goal and is a form of persistence, even if it doesn't end up showing in any standard metrics. So persistence is incredibly important to completion. This is, again, a no-brainer. This is obvious. And persistence has many valences. It can mean retention, but it can mean all kinds of other things. So when the Achieving the Dream data, not the data team, the Dream team was putting together the student success priorities, this language of persistence emerged as very important for both priorities. I think most of you have seen these. Heather and Sheila presented them this morning, and there were open fora last week. I will not replicate all of the good content that they've given. And if you're not as familiar with these, I encourage you to go back and look at these priorities and the full student success plan that's available on the college website. But what I just wanted to point out, a couple of things. Both priorities use the language of persistence. So priority 1, increasing fall-to-fall persistence for first-time, full-time students. Priority 2, creating a culture of care that supports all students in persisting from. Some of the differences between these two priorities, these have emerged in our discussions over the last couple of weeks, but just again to highlight, both of these represent a 10% increase in the number of students achieving whatever the success is for the priority. So for priority 1, fall-to-fall persistence for that cohort is really, what we're really measuring is essentially retention. For priority 2, we're broadening out the definition of persistence, but in both cases, we want to increase the number of people meeting that goal by 10%. Priority 1 focuses on a known metric and a public metric, and one, again, that is tracked by iPads, which is this first-time, full-time, fall-to-fall retention. So we're aligning ourselves with a known published metric. This is important because it allows us to move the needle on that metric, and for ranking agencies and other groups and accreditors who use these known published iPads metrics, they will see our progress. Whereas priority 2 is focused more on a comprehensive metric. This is not a standard iPads or VFA metric. This is us being as comprehensive as we can in thinking about student success. Priority 1, the goal is connected to benchmark institutions, Kingsborough Community College, Passaic Community College, and to national averages. So if we hit this goal, we will be competitive with the benchmark institutions and above the national average. That's an ambitious goal, but we think it's doable. For priority 2, the goal is more internal. There are no benchmarks. There's no comparative data on this. So we're using the same idea, a 10% increase, to come up with an internal goal. Priority 1, I talked about, use a narrower definition of persistence. Priority 2 uses a broader definition of persistence. Priority 1 is institutionally focused. It's about how do you measure the institution compared to how other institutions are doing. Priority 2 is really student focused. We want to measure persistence and success in the ways that best reflect what the students are trying to accomplish. So it's a broader, comprehensive, full student body approach. So the question becomes, well, if we think about leading indicators and lagging indicators and time, we know that obviously persistence and retention are important leading indicators to completion. But what are the leading indicators for persistence? What are the things that the students do when they first start at the college or when they enter an academic year? What are the things that they do? What are the factors that are indicative of their likely persistence?
That's a huge rhetorical question.
Yes, it is. And
my mind went off into, are students engaged in any way in any experiential opportunity, whether it's interning or just being at a field site or anything that connects them to their chosen career path. You know, is there any opportunity, have they engaged with anything during the summer or during the academic year that gives them a different level of engagement on just being in a classroom? You know, there's so many questions to ask related to that question. It's a powerful question, and we could look at it from a number of different ways.
Yes, that's, I think, looking at the experiential aspects, both prior to college entry and then in that initial college entry, is a huge area to explore. We don't have very good data on it right now, but this is something I'd like to work on over the next year, is how do we get at some of that more qualitative engagement data?
This goes back to the meatball truck question I used to ask all the time. You know, we provide tens of thousands of dollars worth of food trucks, and we always have the meatball truck coming because, you know, the thought was if we provide meatballs, more students will persist.
Yep.
That's what I was told. And then I always asked, well, does anybody track that? Like those who went to the meatball truck 3 times and also picked up movie tickets at student activities and also went through new student orientation, are they more likely to succeed?
Absolutely, yeah. Eric, it's one
lending
of my
the
goals
meatball.
this year to have a meatball index for you. We'll try to get a meatball index. No, I think there's those kind of anecdotal, qualitative sense of these are interventions that we think will help the students. How do we turn those into data and measure them are going to be a huge task this year. But one way to get at this, to determine what are the factors that cause people to persist, is to do some predictive modeling based on harder data, so data that we know. And this is a time, I don't want to go down the weeds of predictive modeling, but for those of you who sort of shudder when you hear that phrase used, I just want to give a brief sidebar on what that means and what we're doing. So we're going to do, and I've done this over the spring and summer, and my office is going to continue to do this as we move forward this year. And in this example, we took all students entering in the fall from 2008 to 2018. And we start with something we know, right? We start with an outcome. Did the student return the subsequent fall? And really, that's a binary question. Either they did or they didn't. So it's a yes, no. So we know that. We know all who the students are, and we know whether or not they return. So we're starting with something they know. We know, sorry. And then we start layering in data that we know about the students. So we have demographic information. We have financial aid data. Right? Patrick wrote, do they change time status? We have academic performance data. How many credits do they earn? What kind of courses did they take? What kind of grades do they get? What GPA did they get? ... meaning the more data we can add to this, the better. The more data we can throw at this problem, the better, with some caveats, which I'll talk about in a sec. So now we have 2 pieces. We have data we know about the student, and we have the outcome we're interested in. Did the student return subsequent fall? And the key question is, what's the connection? What's the connection between all these data and that outcome? When we try to do analysis, what emerges as the important features or factors out of all these data? What are the things that most likely predict that outcome? To do that, we use what's called a regression. Some of you might be familiar with a linear regression. That's the standard kind of regression that is used in a lot of data analysis. For this kind of predictive model, we use a logistic regression because we're modeling just a binary outcome. Did the student return yes or no? Linear regression models a continuous outcome. So the outcome could be a number on an infinite scale, not simply a binary outcome. I won't go into logistic regression because it's a rabbit hole that people spend their whole lives studying. But suffice it to say, there are tools out there that allow us to do this in many ways. And so we're using, when I did this, I used a couple of logistic regression tools. One is Vera Predict, and the other is R. And the reason I use two different tools is to make sure they more or less agreed with each other and that I was approaching the problem in the right way. So a predictive model tells us, among other things, which of all those factors, all that data, are statistically significant. That's a label that gets thrown around a lot. Statistical significance means essentially, is the thing that you found not likely to have happened by chance, but is there actually a meaningful relationship between the things that you're looking at? It also tells us which factors contribute most to the predictive power of the model. So there might be a feature or factor that is significant, but it actually doesn't contribute that much to the predictive powers. So it's important to know that it's significant, but there might be other things that account for more of the predictive power. It's important to know whether the factors we're looking at are independent from one another. What you don't want to get into in a place where you have what look like two different variables, but they're actually tracking the same thing. And if they're both in your model, they take away from each other and it sort of skews the data. So doing these analyses in the right way can help you determine which factors are independent and which ones should be in the model. And then finally, you want to look at how well does the model that you've developed predict your known outcomes. And you do this by basically splitting your data in two, right? So I had that big set of data, 10 years worth of data, and what you end up doing is you chunk it into two groups. The first group you use to develop the model, and then you test that model against the second group, and you see how accurate the model is. How closely did it come, in this example, to predicting whether or not the students were retained the second fall. Just for your information, I did two different models. One is fall to spring retention, one is fall to fall retention. On the latter, we're currently at about 80% accuracy. On the former, we're currently about 70% accuracy. The kind of threshold over which you want to at least get to is 60%. So we're getting there, but there's more work to do. And just to say, predictive models are not foolproof. You can't press a button and tell exactly what's going to happen to any one student. This is statistics, it's approximate, but you're trying to narrow the likely set of meaningful data points so that you can use that to focus your attention and energies. They're dependent on data quality and volume. So this comes into play sometimes with demographic data. So I think an interesting example that I think of, I think people are interested in students who self-identify as disabled and whether there are barriers to success for disabled students. I included disability in my initial model, but there's so many unknowns and missing data elements for disability data that it's hard to really put it into a model and have it return any useful data. That doesn't mean that disability is an important factor to look at and we want to continue to think about it. It just means that sometimes the way that data flow through our systems mean that they're not amenable to a predictive model. So we don't want to just use these models as the only thing we're looking at because sometimes the questions we're interested in don't fit well into the model. And of course, they're subject to change as circumstances change and new data emerge. So a prime example for us, we're going to have data on directed self-placement at the end of the term. And we're going to want to use that data and put it into the model. And I realize I'm running out of time, so I'll try to be less voluble and move ahead to some data that helps us look at some of these earlier indicators of retention and success. So when we did the model, here are some things that were revealed to be significant. One is a student's Pell status is positively significant with retention. So if a student receives a Pell grant, they're more likely to retain. Age is negatively correlated. The older you are, the less likely you are to retain. Among all the gender and race ethnicity variables, only being Asian is positively correlated with retaining the second term. Those are what I'm calling demographic factors. They're important to track. They help us think about equity, but they're not really things we can control or intervene in, right? You can't change the age of students coming into your college. They are what they are, but it's important to keep track of these for equity and other purposes. Are there services one can put into place for older students, for non-traditional students? that can help with their retention and other success. On the academic side, here are some of the factors that that have come through the predictive model. One is if you earn 0 credits of any kind in the first semester, that's negatively correlated with retention. Conversely, if you earn 6 credits or more of any kind in that first semester, that's positively correlated with retention. If you pass CSS 100 in your first semester, that's positively correlated. A GPA of 2.0 is positively correlated. And if you meet what's called the PACE standard of completing at least 67% of credits attempted, that's positively correlated. So these are some of the primary factors we found so far. Again, we're going to continue to refine our model as we move forward. But again, these are right now seem to be fairly robust. They're not complete, but they're fairly robust predictors of student retention. So let's look at students earning 0 credits. And I will give credit where credit is due. Our Achieving the Dream data coach, Renee Garcia, told us right when we started, you have to look at students earning 0 credits. That's a really important metric. Sure enough, when we did this analysis, it was one of the most important factors in predicting retention. It's not surprising given the nature of the metric, but it's nice. It was good to know that Renee put us on that track and that it was a good metric to look at, and it's helping us design our analysis. So let's just look overall. I've been wrestling with these charts all week. I'm not sure exactly why they're not rendering exactly how I like, but you'll get the gist. This is over the last 5 years worth of terms, the percentage of students earning 0 credits. This is all students on campus. And you'll see over the past few terms, it's hovered between, let's say, 12 and 15%. Interestingly, in this last term, in the 2020 spring term, our coronavirus remote learning term, the percentage went down, which is good, right? We want fewer students earning 0 credits. I think there's a whole research project here about why this percentage went down. Is it students preemptively dropping classes if they didn't think they wanted to do remote learning or didn't think they would be successful? Are there other factors? This is something to pursue, but it's an interesting metric. So that's the overall big picture. How many people are earning 0 credits? In the Achieving the Dream world, you'll hear people talk about you need to disaggregate your data, though. You can't just look at everyone, you have to disaggregate into different groups. And I'm going to show you a couple of disaggregations, and that's what we'll have time for. So one is disaggregating by gender. This is a diagnostic. It's important to disaggregate data by gender. In this example, there are no real differences by gender. Men and women earn 0 credits at the same rate. So that's an example of disaggregation that is diagnostic, but hasn't shown us an equity gap. The second one is by age group. And we bucketed students under 20, 20 to 24, and 25 and older. It's a little hard to see in this chart, but generally there's a slight gap for students who are under 20. And we've seen this in other data. This is a known phenomenon. And this is a student earning 0 credits. So this means students under 20 are outperforming the students in the other age groups. If we look at only students in their first term, so when students are entering the college, not just everyone, that difference is magnified, and you'll see that under 20 group often doing significantly better than the other age groups. So again, as we disaggregate and we look at the different groupings of students, some trends emerge and help inform us about where we might want to make interventions. The final thing I'm going to show is by looking at the students' essentially college readiness, which I essentially said put everyone into either they're an ESL student. If they're not an ESL student, are they an academic foundation student? If they're neither of those, they're college ready. And here you see some big gaps in terms of these students earning 0 credits, college-ready students outperforming the other 2 groups. I don't think this is necessarily surprising to anyone, but again, this is, by doing this disaggregation, you're trying to validate what you might have as an intuition or as an anecdotal sense, and really use that to start digging down into these data. So that's getting close to the end time. I was hoping to do some brainstorming. Let's maybe try to do that at a later point in this semester, or I will follow up with folks and think about some brainstorming here. But I wanted to get to our next steps. What we're planning to do in this realm of measuring and thinking about the data related to student success. So we're going to have the public release of the VFA in the next couple of weeks. I'm putting together some student success dashboards, which are going to have all kinds of data along this line, different metrics, different important, significant metrics, disaggregated by various groupings, so we can really see the different dimensions of student success for our key overarching priorities, which are persistence. So which students are persisting, what are the factors that are causing them to persist, and what if we disaggregate amongst all those factors? So be on the lookout for student success dashboards. The college is going to launch Sense, which is a version of SESI. It is a survey to incoming students to try to gauge their engagement in their initial term on campus. Eric, to your earlier point, that may get at some of those broader engagement questions. And the Sense survey this year will also have a specific module focused on the coronavirus, COVID-19, and remote learning. And so we will continue to collect data on those specific topics. We're going to continue to refine and expand our predictive models. Again, as we discover more and as we get more data and discover new sources of data, we will adjust the models. I would also, right now we're really modeling retention, but I'd like to be able to model the broader sense of persistence, model ultimate degree completion, and be able to model other types of student success as students define them. And to do that, we're going to have to be creative about thinking about new sources of data. We're going to do an analysis of directed self-placement data, and we're going to look at even earlier momentum. So right now we're looking at sort of how did you do in the first term, but we can start looking even earlier. How did you do when you started the term? Where did you place? What were your midterm grades? Did you have retention alerts? Are there other very early, even pre-enrollment metrics that we can use to help predict some of these outcomes? So that's where I am. And I've gone past my time. If people have questions, I'm happy to hang around until 3. I know many of you have to leave for other session. You can put your questions in the chat. You can unmute yourself and ask the question. And otherwise, please do follow up with me over email with questions, thoughts, and ideas.
John, this is Professor Imam. Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
This was really very well-rounded, but there are few things which I think we need to really talk about. One,
Yeah.
it's very good that you are trying to put a dashboard, but do you think that showing the 14% completion rate in 3 years, will that encourage students, or they may start looking from different eye?
I mean, yes, someone put that in the chat.
I put it there. Actually.
Yeah, great. No, that's a good. I mean, I think, right, whenever you publish data, especially if you publish it without thinking about how it's going to be received and that you don't have the right explanations around it, you want to be careful that people don't misinterpret it or, in this example, get demoralized by it. I think if we're doing a student success dashboard, I don't know that we need to necessarily put that 14% in there, because that 14% is already out there in the world. People can find that. at the same time, it is already out there in the world. Whether or not we put it on our dashboard, it exists and it's out there. People around the world know it. The federal government knows it. Our accreditors know it. So I think if we're going to put it in the dashboard, we want to put it in the context and then point people to the other metrics of success that we're developing and the broader metrics of outcomes and success that the VFA provides. So I think it's a good question. We want to think about how these data are received, but they're out there whether or not we call attention to them. And I think at least by calling attention to them, we get people thinking about what some of the problems might be and what some of the issues with the data are. Other
Yeah, I think basically the dashboard is going to be consumed mostly by the students. Yes, you are right that all the federal agency and all that, they know. But as you mentioned before you started, that whatever is obvious, generally we don't pay attention to that.
right.
That may come into play over here.
So I'm a data person, and I'm always of the opinion that more data is better, and
Okay.
the more we put out there, and the more we educate people on how to read it, which is an important piece, right? The better. Even if the data aren't always good news, at least that gets everyone looking at the same thing. So from my perspective, as we put out these dashboards, we really want to have good explanatory material to make sure that people don't just look at a number and say, oh, 14% is bad. In that example, we want to really make people understand, here's what that means, and here's what it doesn't mean, and here's why it's not the right metric for thinking about our students holistically. So I agree with everything you're saying. I just think we need to own our data as opposed to have it flow out into the world and have other people potentially misuse it.
John, this is Heather. I was just going to add that I think one objective of your office and also for Achieving the Dream work is really to democratize data, to help everyone, to make data widely available, and for people to get in the habit of making data-informed decisions and seeing the data. And again, really kind of owning it as our data, not
Yeah.
IR's data or not IPED's data, but our data as a community.
Yeah, and in particular to the previous speaker, it's the students' data as well, right? It's data about them and what they're doing. And part of the problem often when you show this kind of data is that students don't recognize themselves in the data. And so that's part of the job, again, of this work of making useful dashboards and useful visualizations of student successes. How do we help the students recognize their own journey and their own progress through the institution in that data? And that's not easy. We're going to have to work at it. There are going to be a lot of iterations, but I think it's important. Other thoughts, questions, ideas? Well, thank you all. If you do have any follow-up, please don't hesitate to contact me. Again, in the spirit of making things public and accessible, I'm going to turn this into something that is accessible through the portal or at least through the web, so that people who were not able to participate or who want to go back to what was presented here will be able to see it going forward, and it will become part of a set of references and resources for people to use as we continue to make more data available. So thank you all, and I look forward to working with you all on thinking about student success data over the next year. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. This was great.
Thank you. It really was.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That was great, John.
Thank you, Dorothea.
It really was. I mean, even I got something out of it, and I work with you, so.
Unfortunately, I blew through the time, which was bad planning on my part.
Well, you know, time flies.
I even
You got most of it done.
yeah, I even practiced, you know, but it doesn't always work out. But I hope people,
But you had enough time to explain,
yeah,
and your slides were really good.
thank you.
Good job.
Are you going to all college council?
No.
Okay.
So,
So how has the day been for you so far?
pretty good. I tried to log into other workshops, but everybody was behind. You're not the only one. Every workshop was behind. So,
Well, you know, it's hard to do online, right? This stuff is not easy.
it's new for us. So, good job. Good job.
I'm just saving the full chat because I want to go through and
Okay.
let's see. Oh, did we stop recording?
Is this the button right here? Oh, did you stop? I think it's still recording.
Okay.
Okay, now I think it stopped. Yeah, I think a lot of people enjoyed it.
It's still recording.
Oh, is it?
So everyone's gonna hear us have this discussion.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's not your fault. I just can't figure out how to.
Oh, I saw it here. I'm gonna hit the button, okay?
Yeah.